Good morning. Uh, Today we're going to cover, we've covered this. We've covered audit approaches upside down, inside out, but this is just another look at it. It may help some of you. One of the problems, students get overwhelmed. Some students get overwhelmed because they look at this and they say, gosh, there's 8 different approaches I have to learn. No, I think that makes it more complicated than it need be. If we get the concepts down, I think there's 2 approaches with a couple little wrinkles. So I'm going to try and approach it that way, 2 approaches and a couple of little wrinkles. If we don't believe the controls are effective, we're going to take a primarily substantive approach. Period. End of report. Controls aren't effective, primarily substantive approach. Remember, we cannot reduce control risk. We assess control risk. We don't reduce control risk. Now, if it's a public company, we're going to perform some test of controls because we're going to issue a SOX 404 report. So if we're going to say their controls are not effective, we need evidence to support that opinion. If it's a private company, we aren't going to perform any test of controls. We don't need to perform any test of controls. When we believe controls are effective, we preliminarily assess control risk as low and take the reduced level of control risk. With one wrinkle, if it's a private company and we believe substantive test will be cheaper than test of controls, we're going to take the primarily substantive approach. So to me, we don't believe controls are effective, primarily substantive approach with a wrinkle. We believe controls are effective, reduced level control risk approach with a wrinkle. We don't believe the controls are effective. We preliminarily assess control risk is high. We must take a primarily substantive approach. Their controls are not effective, therefore we cannot rely on them. We're going to assess control risk is high. We're going to perform extensive substantive test, the evidence to reduce detection risk to an acceptable level. For public companies, we're going to perform some test controls to support our Sarbanes-Oxley 404 report. We need evidence to support our opinion that the controls are not effective. For private companies, we do not need to perform any test of controls. Primarily substantive. If we believe the controls are effective, then in my mind, I'm going to take the reduced level of control risk approach with an asterisk. I know I need to check something, but my default is reduced level control risk approach. For public companies, we're always going to take the reduced level control risk approach. If we preliminarily assess controls to be effective, then we're going to preliminarily assess control risk as low and take a reduced level of control risk for public companies. Okay, because we're going to have to issue a SOX 404 report. So we're going to, public company, we believe their controls are effective. We preliminarily assess control risk is low. We'll perform extensive test of controls. We'll have evidence that the controls actually are effective and that our assessment is correct. And then we can limit our substantive test. We always have to do some substantive test. Public, private, always have to do some substantive test, but we can limit the extent of our substantive testing. Reduced level control risk approach. Private company, we believe the controls are effective. Private company. Now with a private company, we actually have a choice, right? Because we can get audit risk down to 0.05 with either a low level of control risk or a low level of detection risk. Okay. Only one of the two needs to be low. So for private companies, again, my default is reduced level control risk approach. We believe it will cost less to perform tested controls than substantive test. Then I'm going to preliminarily assess control risk as low, and I'll perform extensive tested controls, evidence that the controls are effective, and limit my substantive test, reduce level control risk approach. Same exact situation as a public company. Again, private company, we believe control risks are effective. We preliminarily assess control risk as low. But if we believe it will cost more to perform tested controls than substantive tests, if we believe substantive tests are cheaper than tested controls, then with a private company, I'm going to take the primarily substantive approach. If we believe substantive tests are cheaper, then we'll perform extensive substantive tests, and that will give enough evidence to reduce detection risk and audit risk to an acceptable level. We won't perform any test. We don't need to perform any tested controls. Primarily substantive approach. But we're going to need to explain in our work papers why we preliminarily assess control risk as low, but then took a primarily substantive approach and changed our final assessment of control risk as high. We can't assess control risk as anything except high because we don't have any evidence that the controls are effective. But we're going to need to document that and explain that in our work papers. So again, to me, once I get my head around it, there's really two approaches. Controls aren't effective. I'm going to take a primarily substantive approach. I get a little wrinkle there. Some tested controls for public companies because of SOX 404. Private companies, I don't need to do any tested controls. Both cases, I'm going to do extensive substantive testing. If the controls are effective, then default, I'm going to take the reduced level control risk approach. Do extensive tested controls, and I can limit the extent of my substantive testing. The wrinkle or the exception is if it's a private company and I believe substantive test will cost less than tested controls, I'm going to take a primarily substantive approach, perform no tested controls, and perform extensive substantive tests. I hope that helps, and for some of you, if it makes it clearer, that's great. Some of you already had that figured out. Have a good day.